If you're like most people, you think the devilish name Lucifer comes from a biblical passage on the chief of fallen angels. In truth, it actually comes from this passage, which concerns the king of Israel's ancient foe, Babylon. And that raises a question. How did this city become so hated that one of its kings could actually be seen as an allegory for Satan? Stay tuned, we'll take a look at that, and take a quick peek at Mystery Babylon of Revelation, the so-called mother of all adulteries and the abomination of the earth. What the heck is that all about? Alright, ancient Babylon sat on the Euphrates River at the base of the Mesopotamian Delta. Founded 20th century BC-ish, it was the first metropolis of known history. And the first thing we need to understand is how it got so gosh darn big. There's two main reasons. The first is that it was well situated on incredibly productive farmland. It's a desert now, but the Greek historian Herodotus wrote in the 400s BC that if he described how lush the area was, that his Greek audience would have thought him mad. The second reason has to do with this man, Hammurabi, king of Babylon in the 1700s BC. He gets credit for the legal code that defined Babylon for much of its existence. And here, we get a chance to see society building at its most basic level. So, how is it that a bunch of laws could cause a city to grow to such a tremendous size? The answer is something we all take for granted now, but was nothing to sniff at in ancient times. It did it by making life predictable. If you saw my first Debating Worldviews video, you know that pre-civilized cultures had a much higher murder rate than settled communities, 40 to 100 times higher, in most instances, than even modern cities like Baltimore and Chicago. The reason for this is simple. They were afraid of each other. Try this for a thought experiment. Imagine walking through the woods 6,000 years ago and seeing a stranger. What do? What do you think he's going to do? He might attack you. Would you have the advantage if you attacked first? Does he think you're going to attack first to get that advantage? Will this cause him to attack first? It may all sound like paranoid fantasy, but in the absence of enforced laws, these were valid questions. Legal codes like Hammurabian law took the guesswork out of life. And I use the example of murder, but of course the law of Hammurabi tried to make all aspects of city life, from marriage to property ownership, religious observance, on and on, predictable. In a time where the rulers tended to claim to be gods, and so could do whatever they wanted, having even the ruler himself under these laws meant that people could have a much stronger sense of ownership in their own lives. This is where we get the true power of settled communities as opposed to our early wandering tribes. People were suddenly able to specialize, to concentrate on what they did best. They didn't have to prepare for every possible eventuality anymore. Not big and burly? Okay. You don't have to spend time learning to fight. Other people can do that. You can do what you're good at. Babylon, early in its existence, had lots of people doing what they did best, and so it developed faster. It had geography working in its favor, had a legal system that enfranchised its people far beyond the average for the time, and so it became a cultural and cosmopolitan heavyweight. Arts, sciences, they practically invented astrology. We still can't figure out the Hanging Gardens. How did the building deal with tree taproots and water runoff? And this is what defined it. Right up until the end, which is where everything goes off the rails, and we'll discuss that in a minute. For now, just realize that Babylon wasn't a military power like Assyria to the north, or an ancient religious Mecca like Egypt to the west. Babylon survived for centuries because its culture was highly attractive, and when other nations encountered it, they tended to acculturate. They tended to adopt Babylonian ideals. For instance, Babylon was, technically, conquered first by the Hittites, then the Kassites. Both times the invaders stayed. They liked what they saw, and eventually they became Babylonians. In fact, even at the end, Babylon was never really destroyed. It was simply replaced as the world's cultural giant by Greece. And once Greek culture supplanted Babylonian culture, and on top of that, the area eventually took a big hit in agricultural production due to centuries of constant human habitation and conflict, well, it really just didn't have a reason to exist anymore. But with all of that, Babylon probably doesn't sound like such a bad place to most of you, at least not compared to some of its contemporaries like the conquest-happy Assyrians. So, why did the Hebrew biblical writers hate it so much? The reason had to do with what they claimed it stood for in the beginning, before Hammurabi, and again at the end. With this, we'll see a pattern of decline that the writer of Revelation claimed would one day happen again, and that's where our Mystery Babylon comes in. Let's start at the beginning. The book of Genesis claims that Babylon's forebear, Babel, was founded by a man called Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord, it says. Except Hebrew tradition adds a couple of details that didn't find its way into the text. One, it tells us we should probably have translated that word hunter as nomad, as in the kind of nomadic raiders that we discussed in the Amalekite video. The other tells us that phrase, before the Lord, was meant to convey opposition, instead of something like underneath the Lord, which would have meant subservience. No, Nimrod is remembered as history's first atheist, and the settlement he founded, Babel, is remembered as having built the tower we're all familiar with. A couple of quick points here as well. For the ancients, to name something was to state its true identity, and knowledge really was power back in those days. For pagans, just knowing the true name of one of the gods gave you power over it. And of course, anyone familiar with the New Testament and the Bible would be familiar with the way that people like the Apostle Paul got renamed, signaling a profound change in their identity. The idea here was that the people of Babel wanted to define themselves. We're told this led to confusion, which is what happens when you don't have common definitions, but everyone is defining things for themselves. Strange, right? I mean, imagine a term like, largely peaceful, and imagine that suddenly some people are just completely redefining it. Wouldn't that just be nuts? Okay, back on track. The root word for Babylon means confusion in both Hebrew and Greek. To the Hebrews, Babylon meant the land of confusion. So when Babylon conquered and deported the Hebrews living in Judea, the biblical writers had an obvious symbol for what happened. The Hebrews prospered as long as they followed their original covenant before God, their original charter, if you will. And the world made sense. But when they abandoned it, they were, each and every one of them, literally carried off into the land of confusion. So we get this strange allegory between a nation falling apart and an individual sliding off into mental illness. This image gets hammered home in the biblical book of Daniel, much of which takes place during the Babylonian exile. And early in the book, the story centers on the relationship between the Hebrew slave Daniel and the Babylonian king at the time, Nebuchadnezzar. And how does the book of Daniel present Nebuchadnezzar? Well, it might be too much to call him an atheist, but he certainly was skeptical of the claims being made by the religious authorities around him. He believed he had a prophetic dream. He then demanded the court magicians not only interpret the dream, but to prove that they could work miracles, tell him what he dreamed, then interpret it. And, like Nimrod, he liked himself a bit too much for the biblical writers. After Daniel interpreted the king's dream, telling him that the statue he saw in his dream was him, well, Nebuchadnezzar had a statue constructed and ordered everyone to bow down to it. And although it never actually says it, the implication was certainly that the statue was the statue from his dreams, a statue of him. Later, we're told he claimed that he built Babylon entirely by his own greatness. What happened? It says he went insane. Same motif, defiance toward God and self-aggrandizement leading to a mental breakdown, the land of confusion. I'm not pulling this out of thin air. Our biblical end times prophecies make it very clear that this is what the writers were going for. In the Old Testament, we get this. Babylon was a gold cup in the Lord's hand. The nations drink her wine, therefore they have now gone mad. This passage is saying that the key essence of Babylon, which it likens to a sort of drinking the Kool-Aid motif, will one day become something the nations of the world consume. And this will lead to confusion, to madness on a mass scale. This image is presented twice in the book of Revelation, the maddening wine, as most English translations go. Drink the Kool-Aid, you go insane. The only addition in Revelation is the prostitute, the whore, if you'll pardon the ugly word. An image of somebody who sells this Kool-Aid, a figure that presumably would sell anything. So, what exactly is the Babylonian wine of madness? Well, obviously it's the belief system that made the Babylonians distinct from the pagan world. And here, we need just a tiny bit more historical context. Remember Nebuchadnezzar's skepticism? That didn't occur in a vacuum. We have ancient sources that tell us just what those beliefs were in Babylon during his reign and after, when the city went into sudden sharp decline. As a regional power, Babylon is generally considered to have ended when the Persian king Cyrus conquered the city in 539 BC. But it wasn't much of a conquest. There's two main versions for how this happened. In one, the The Persians diverted the Euphrates and snuck in through the water grate. In the other, they just showed up, and the Babylonians opened the gate and let them right on in. Either way, the Babylonians didn't put up much of a fight. And why would they? By this time, their city seemed to have turned its back on the things that made them great in past centuries. Many of them were starving inside, and we don't know exactly why. Hammurabian law no longer defined them, that's clear enough. So what did define them? This. And this is the bizarre part. You see, we call this postmodernism because around 50 years ago it was the newest thing going. Kind of ironic, since the belief system is at least 2,500 years old. And if Hebrew oral tradition is right about Nimrod and Babel, more like 4,500. Mystery Babylon, a mystery no more. It turns out that in the ancient world, which was almost uniformly pagan, there was one kingdom that eventually turns its back on its own laws and went all in for relative truth. The kind of relative truth they started with at Babel. Live under an objective set of laws, and life becomes predictable. People who can predict outcomes tend to prosper. People who are prosperous tend to become proud. And people who are proud tend to defy community standards. At that point, all that's left, communities whose standards are routinely defied become confusing again. And confused communities fall apart. That's what they do every time. That's what happened then. That's what's happening now. The wine of Babylon, the nations drink it. Therefore, they have now gone mad. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Click like and subscribe and click the notification bell, and we'll try and keep the videos coming. Also, see the link below to order Book 1 of the Holocaust Engine series, our pandemic post-apocalyptic horror that won the Pinnacle Award for the best science fiction novel of 2020.